They stole our land with a smile and made $500,000 off it. My grandfather trusted them with nothing more than a fence line agreement. Now there's a luxury resort where our family cows used to graze, and they thought we wouldn't notice. My grandfather's farm sat on the edge of town like a quiet memory no one could forget. It was a place filled with wide open skies, slow sunsets, and fields that turned gold every fall. The kind of land that made you breathe easier. He had worked that land for over 50 years, raising cattle, growing vegetables, and teaching us how to live simply and honestly. Everyone in the area respected him. He didn't care about money or fancy things. He cared about the land, the animals, and doing right by people. So when the new housing development started creeping up nearby, he didn't think much of it. A few roads, a few homes, a few families moving in, nothing he hadn't seen before. But then the Homeowners Association, or HOA, introduced themselves. It started off friendly enough. A few well-dressed board members from the HOA came by one afternoon while my grandfather was mending a fence. They told him they were building a family-friendly neighborhood nearby and wanted to create a small walking trail for residents. Nothing big, just a path that would cut through the very edge of his pasture so kids could walk safely instead of using the road. They promised it wouldn't disturb anything, and they'd even maintain it. They made it sound like a good thing. And my grandfather, being the kind soul he was, agreed. He didn't sign any contracts or give up any ownership. Just a verbal agreement, a neighborly handshake, like folks used to do. Over the next few years, small changes began to happen. The trail was built paved, not dirt, but still small. Then came a few benches, then street lamps, then signs. None of it seemed too serious at first, just improvements for the trail, or so we thought. But when I came home from college one summer to help out on the farm, I noticed something strange. There was a new paved road where there had never been one before, leading deeper into our land, behind the hill where the cows used to graze. I walked down that road and stood in shock. There, in the middle of our property, was what looked like the early construction of a massive building, glass-walled, with a parking lot being cleared out. There were workers, bulldozers, and even a billboard that read, "Coming soon, Sunrise Ridge Wellness Resort." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I immediately called my grandfather, who hadn't even noticed the full extent of what was going on back there. He didn't go out to the back part of the property often anymore, and with his health declining, he had trusted the neighbors to be honest. But it was clear now, this wasn't just a trail anymore. They were building something big, something expensive, and it was happening right under our noses. The next day I drove to the county office and asked for maps and land records. After a long wait and some confused looks from the clerk, I was handed a set of documents that nearly made my blood boil. According to the county's property records, several acres of our land, acres that my grandfather had never sold, never signed over, never agreed to give away, were listed under the HOA's name. Not the trail, but the entire back portion of the farm, including the exact spot where construction was happening. There was no bill of sale, no money exchanged, just a trail of paperwork that suggested a series of annexations and adjustments approved at zoning meetings my grandfather was never invited to. I showed the documents to him that night. He sat in his chair, silent for a long time, staring at the papers through his glasses. Then he said something I'll never forget. "They waited until I got too old to fight." He was right. They had slowly chipped away at our land through legal tricks, hidden agendas, and probably a few bribes at the planning office. They had taken advantage of his trust, of his old-fashioned way of doing things, and used it to steal something priceless from him over the next few weeks. I kept a close eye on the development. Fencing went up, trees were cut down, cabins were framed, a swimming pool was poured. They were building a luxury resort, complete with spa services, private yoga studios, and overnight lodging. Their website claimed it was nestled on exclusive land, surrounded by peaceful nature, but that nature was my family's land, and they were marketing it as if they owned every inch. I tried to speak to the HOA board. I attended one of their monthly meetings and waited patiently until they opened the floor for questions. I stood and calmly explained the situation, asked how they had come to claim ownership of land that had always been ours. The room went quiet. The president of the board, a smug man in a navy blue suit, told me they had assumed control based on historical usage and easement agreements. I pushed back. I told them there was no sale, no deed transfer, nothing legal giving them the right to build a resort. His smile didn't even waver. "Then you're free to challenge it," he said. "But we've already invested a lot of money." That moment changed everything for me. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about justice. It was about standing up for a man who had spent his life protecting that land, only to have it taken from him by people who thought he was too old or too kind to fight back. I promised myself that night, as I walked back across the field toward our broken fence, that I would fix this. I didn't care how long it took. I didn't care how powerful they thought they were. This wasn't just property, it was family, and they had no idea who they were messing with. The very next morning I hired a lawyer. I didn't care about the cost. I wanted answers. I wanted justice. What had happened to my grandfather's land wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. and someone needed to pay for it. My lawyer, Mr. Callahan, was an older man with a sharp mind and a calm voice. He listened carefully to everything I told him, then looked me straight in the eye and said, "If what you're saying is true, and it certainly looks like it, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of property fraud I've seen in years." Together, we spent weeks gathering every piece of evidence we could find. We dug up old land surveys that showed exactly where our property lines had always been. We found tax records in my grandfather's name going back decades. We even discovered a series of HOA meeting minutes that mentioned acquiring bordering land through easement extensions. Though none of those meetings had ever been made public or posted legally, they had been manipulating documents quietly, inching their way into our land, acting as if their paper trail would be enough to justify theft. But no matter how clean their files looked, they didn't have the one thing that mattered most: my grandfather's signature. One night, while looking through an old wooden chest in the farmhouse, I found a map hand-drawn by my grandfather. It was dated in 1987. On it, he had clearly marked our borders with notes like "Cornfield ends here" and "Cowgate do not cross." It was all still accurate. That land, every inch of it, had belonged to us. No question. I brought it to Mr. Callahan the next morning. He smiled as he held the map up to the light and said, "They're done." We filed a lawsuit against the HOA and the developers behind the Sunrise Ridge Wellness Resort. It wasn't just a case about land, it was a case about abuse of power. They had stolen property, rezoned it illegally, and built a business on it worth over $450,000. And now, they were going to be exposed. News of the lawsuit spread quickly through the community. At first, people didn't know what to believe. The HOA had a good reputation, or at least, they had controlled the public image well. But once the court documents became public, things changed. Local news picked it up. Reporters started calling. Neighbors began to realize that the friendly organization that claimed to be for the community had quietly turned into a greedy machine, feeding on the land of those too old or too unaware to fight back. When the court date finally arrived, my grandfather and I sat in the front row. He was weaker than before, his hands shaking slightly as he held onto his cane, but his eyes were sharp. He didn't want revenge, he wanted justice. I could feel the weight of his silence. The years he had trusted the wrong people, the ache of watching them build something flashy on top of everything he'd worked for. The HOA president, Mr. Lennox, walked into the courtroom looking as smug as ever. He wore a new suit, probably custom-tailored, and barely glanced at us. His lawyers, too, looked bored, as if they'd handled 100 cases like this before. But that confidence faded quickly once Mr. Callahan began laying out our evidence. Every document, every aerial photo, every zoning violation was displayed on a large screen. The judge, a stern woman with a sharp tone, asked pointed questions. The HOA team couldn't answer. Where is the deed transfer? Why wasn't the property owner notified of zoning changes? How was this land legally developed if ownership was never established? Their answers were weak. They leaned heavily on vague terms like implied consent and community benefit, but none of it held up. When Mr. Callahan showed the judge the hand-drawn map from 1987 and compared it to current county records, the courtroom went silent. The two maps were identical, except the current records had mysteriously shifted the boundary lines, carving out the resort's land as if by magic. Then came the testimony. My grandfather spoke softly but clearly. He explained how the HOA had first approached him, how they had promised only a walking path, and how he had never agreed to any permanent construction. He paused, looked right at Mr. Lennox and said, "You smiled in my face and lied to me. You stole from an old man who trusted you." Even the judge seemed moved, and in that moment, I could see that the tide had turned. The final judgment came a few weeks later. The HOA and its partners were found guilty of fraud, unlawful development, and illegal land use. The court ordered the resort to be shut down immediately. All construction was to cease. Any standing structures were to be removed at the HOA's expense, and most importantly, they were ordered to pay our family $450,000 in damages, the estimated value of the profits they'd made from using our land without permission. The day we received the court papers, my grandfather and I sat quietly on the porch, watching the sun set behind the fields. He didn't smile, he didn't cry, he just said, "It's not about the money, it's about making things right." The months that followed were a mix of relief and sadness. The resort buildings were torn down. The land slowly returned to the way it used to be: quiet, natural, undisturbed. Grass grew where the swimming pool had been. The birds came back, and so did the peace. But the truth is, something had changed in me. Watching my grandfather nearly lose everything because of other people's greed had opened my eyes. I began attending local council meetings, learning about property rights, and helping other families who had faced similar abuse. I wanted to make sure no one else would be tricked the way he had been, because if a group of strangers could steal land so easily once, what was stopping them from doing it again? My grandfather passed away quietly one winter morning, sitting in his favorite chair near the fireplace. He never got to see the full field bloom again, but he died knowing the land was still ours. I buried him at the edge of the farm, under an old oak tree he planted when I was a child. His headstone reads, "A man of the land, honest, steady, unshaken. That land is still in our family. And it always will be. No matter what paper tricks they try. No matter how powerful they think they are. There are some things that can't be stolen. Our roots run too deep. Our memories stretch too far. And we remember what they did. They thought they were clever. They thought we wouldn't notice. But they forgot one thing. You don't steal from people who still remember where every fence post once stood. Not without a fight. And we fought. And we won." The months after the court's decision were surprisingly quiet. The construction trucks were gone. The workers had vanished. And the heavy sound of machines tearing up the land had stopped completely. For the first time in a long time, the air around the farm felt still and whole again. I could walk the length of the back pasture without hearing a single voice, without seeing a stranger in golf shoes sipping water on our soil. But that quiet wasn't peace. Not yet. Not for me. Even after winning the case, I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. How easily land had been taken. How paper and money nearly erased decades of family history. My grandfather, before he passed, had warned me, what they steal once, they'll try to steal again. I believed him. I believed the fight wasn't over. We had exposed one group, but how many others were quietly doing the same thing across the country? Influence, twisting zoning laws, claiming land with forged documents or silent votes. It wasn't just about us anymore. I began speaking with other landowners in our town, especially older farmers like my grandfather who'd been working the same ground for 30, 40, even 60 years. Their stories were all too familiar. One man, Mr. Douglas, told me how the city had accidentally rezoned a piece of his land into commercial use, then fined him for having animals on it. Another woman, Mrs. Lopez, had signed a utility agreement, only to later find out it had included a hidden clause giving a developer access to build a road through her orchard. One after another, people were being tricked, pressured, or bullied into giving up land they'd held their entire lives. That's when I knew what I had to do. I used part of the $450,000 settlement money not for comfort, not for upgrades, but to create something useful. I founded a small legal aid group called Landline Defense, focused on helping rural families understand their property rights. Most farmers didn't have lawyers. They didn't understand easements, or zoning language, or backroom politics. But I did now, and I wanted to make sure no one else was caught off guard the way my grandfather had been. Within the first few months we got dozens of calls. Some were minor issues, a misplaced survey, a confusing letter from the county, but others were more serious. One case involved a rancher whose neighbor had slowly built a fence deeper into her land each year, until he was grazing cattle on a full acre that didn't belong to him. Another man discovered that a real estate company had been listing part of his woods in an online brochure for future development potential. None of these people knew their rights. Most were too tired to fight, but I wasn't tired. I worked late nights with a small team of volunteers, reading deeds, checking boundary records, attending public meetings, and sending warning letters to anyone who crossed the line literally or legally. We didn't have much power at first, but we had truth, and sometimes that was enough. Word began to spread. The HOA that had stolen our land, they vanished after the lawsuit. The name no longer carried weight in the town. The resort developers quietly backed out of another project in a nearby county after learning that I'd been invited to speak at a zoning meeting there. For the first time, I realized how dangerous silence could be. It wasn't just our family's land they tried to take. It was our voice. They thought no one would say anything, that we'd be too quiet, too polite, too afraid. But we weren't. And I made it my mission to make sure others found their voices too. At the same time, the land itself started to heal. We reseeded the grass, replanted trees, and restored the old cow pond that had been buried under concrete. Wildlife came back, rabbits, deer, even a pair of owls that nested in the barn roof like they used to when I was a boy. Walking the land again, it felt like coming home. Not just to a place, but to a memory. My grandfather may have passed, but every fence post, every dusty trail, every stone in the creek bed whispered the lessons he left behind. Then something unexpected happened. I got a letter handwritten from a member of the old HOA board. Her name was Margaret, and she had been the secretary during the time of the land grab. She apologized deeply. She said she had stayed silent during the meetings because she was afraid of losing her place in the community. She said the board had been pushed by outside developers with promises of big kickbacks and personal rewards. Margaret offered copies of original meeting notes, even drafts of fake maps that had been created to confuse the zoning office. At first I didn't know what to do with it. I had already won the case. The land was back in our name. Why keep chasing ghosts? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized truth doesn't expire. I brought her statement to the county commission. With Margaret's help, an investigation was reopened. Within weeks, 2 former board members were fined. One faced criminal charges for falsifying documents. And new transparency rules were passed requiring public notice for all future land use votes. What began with a quiet theft had now created real change. That was when I finally felt peace. Not because I had punished someone, not because the land was green again, but because the truth had been spoken and heard. My grandfather would have been proud, not just of the victory, but of the fight. He always taught me that land wasn't just dirt, it was memory. It was hard work, trust, family. You can't replace it, and you sure can't fake it. That's why it hurts so much when someone tries to take it. They're not just stealing acres, they're stealing roots. Now, years later, I still walk the land every morning. I talk to the trees, I touch the fences. I remember. And sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear my grandfather's voice. Keep it safe, keep it yours. So I do, because they built a resort on our land and thought we wouldn't. Notice they made nearly $500,000 off a lie, but we got it all back. And more. We got our voice. We got justice. And in the end, we proved something they never understood. You don't mess with a family who remembers every inch of their land and every promise ever made on it. It had been 2 full years since we took back our land, and still, the impact of what happened rippled through my life like a stone thrown in still water. Every day, I woke up early, stepped out onto the porch with my coffee, and watched the sun stretch across the field my grandfather had once tilled by hand. The resort was gone, the machines, the noise, the crowds gone, but in their place stood something deeper, a new purpose, one that pulled me further into the world of land, law, and legacy than I had ever imagined. Landline defense had grown. What began as a single phone on my farmhouse kitchen counter had now become a small but busy office on Main Street. We had a legal assistant, a part-time investigator, and a volunteer network of over 100 people across 3 counties. I had no plans for any of that. It just happened. Because once people saw that someone could fight back and win, they started believing that they could too. But with more attention came more pressure. Developers didn't like us. In fact, some downright hated us. We began to notice subtle threats and nasty letters with no return address, online rumors calling us anti-progress, even an anonymous complaint to the zoning board accusing me of operating a legal firm. Without a license, of course. None of it stuck, but I could feel it. We had stepped into something bigger than a single piece of stolen farmland. We had poked a machine that had run quietly and comfortably for years, feeding off the silence of those who didn't know how to fight back. One evening I was closing up the office when a man walked in. He was tall, probably in his early 60s, and dressed in worn jeans and a faded button-down shirt. He looked nervous, like someone who wasn't used to asking for help. "Are you the guy who fought the HOA?" he asked. I nodded. He sat down and pulled a folder from his jacket. "I think they took my dad's land," he said, 30 years ago. The folder contained a single photo, an old black and white shot of a barn, long since torn down, and a hill in the background now topped with a gleaming private school. The man, whose name was Raymond, explained that his father had owned a large plot on the north side of town, land that had been passed down from his grandfather and was supposed to stay in the family. But in the 1990s, the city and a local education board claimed the land had been abandoned after his father died, and it was quietly absorbed and sold. Raymond had never believed it. He'd been in the military at the time, and by the time he returned, everything was gone, bulldozed and built over. No public notices, no calls, just a letter from the city saying the property has been reallocated. He had no legal training, no one to help him, so for years he buried it. But after hearing about my story in the news, he decided it was time to try again. I didn't know how deep it would go. The next few months took me into dusty archives, forgotten courtrooms, and quiet back halls of government buildings. Piece by piece, we uncovered something chilling. Raymond's land had never been abandoned. In fact, property taxes had still been paid for 5 years after his father died, paid by an anonymous party we later traced to a law firm connected with a wealthy board member at the school. What we had stumbled into wasn't just a zoning mistake or a greedy HOA. Was a quiet form of land laundering, property taken under false pretenses, cleaned through red tape, and handed over to friends of the system. The more we uncovered, the more dangerous it became. I received a visit from a well-dressed man who claimed to be a private consultant. He told me there was no need to dig any deeper, and that some histories are best left buried. I told him to get off my land and never come back. But I knew this wasn't just about Raymond anymore. It was about every piece of land taken quietly with no one watching. So we went public. I called a press conference in front of the old county records office. I stood there with Raymond beside me, holding the photo of his father's barn, and told our story to every news camera that showed up. I showed the proof. I read the timeline. I named names. And I ended with the one thing. I knew the system feared most sunlight. The backlash was fast. The school board denied everything, of course. So did the city. But the public was already awake. Within days, the state attorney general announced a formal investigation into decades of land reallocation cases. People from other towns came forward with stories just like Raymond's: farms lost, homes misplaced, and behind them the same pattern: fake abandonment, shady filings, and big developers waiting with open wallets. Raymond's case was reopened. The land itself couldn't be given back, not without displacing the school and dozens of buildings, but the court ruled that the transfer had been illegal. The school was forced to pay a multi-million-dollar settlement to Raymond's family, along with a public apology. It wasn't the same as restoring the land, but it was the closest thing to justice after 30 years. That victory changed everything. Suddenly, landline defense wasn't just a local project, it was part of a movement. Universities reached out asking me to speak. Legal groups requested access to our case files for research, and most importantly, lawmakers began crafting a bill to protect landowners from the kinds of backdoor deals that had cost so many their property. We called it the Legacy Land Act, a law that would require clear notification, in-person review, and a certified witness signature for any zoning or property reclassification. No more quiet paperwork, no more hidden votes, no more assuming old folks won't notice when you move a fence. The bill passed the following year. As I stood at the signing ceremony, watching the governor ink his name across the page, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day we tore down the resort. Peace. Not the kind that comes from winning a single fight, but the kind that comes from knowing you've changed the rules of the game for everyone back home. The farm still stood quiet. I had planted wildflowers where the spa once stood. One rebuilt the old cowshed and turned it into a gathering place for local families to come learn about land rights. Kids ran through the fields. Old neighbors stopped by with stories. The porch light stayed on late, and every once in a while I'd look out across the hills and whisper, "We're still here." Because in the end, that's what mattered most. Not just reclaiming what was stolen, but building something stronger in its place. Not just punishing the thieves, but protecting the next generation from being robbed. They thought they could build a resort on our land and bury our legacy under profit. But instead, we built something greater: truth, law, and a voice that wouldn't stay quiet. That's the kind of inheritance my grandfather always dreamed of. And now, it was real. The first rain of spring came softly, tapping against the old windows of the farmhouse like a familiar song. I stood by the porch, holding a cup of coffee, watching the fields drink in the water like they'd been waiting for it all winter. The wildflowers we'd planted on the old resort site were beginning to sprout again, yellow, white, and purple dots rising like memory from the soil. A pair of deer passed along the far fence line. The peace was real now, not temporary. It had settled in like it belonged here. I had spent the last 3 years living two lives, one in the fields of my grandfather's farm, the other in a growing circle of courtrooms, town halls, and state offices. What began as a fight for one man's land had become something far bigger. Landline defense had grown into a respected legal resource across the state. We were now helping families in 4 counties with everything from boundary disputes to zoning appeals. People called us not because they were angry, but because they wanted to be heard. But with growth comes a question. When do you stop fighting? When does it become okay to rest? I'd wrestled with that thought often lately. The days were full. The victories were meaningful. Yet something inside me had shifted. Not broken, but softened. I had carried my grandfather's burden like armor. I wore his silence, his trust, his pain. But now, I could feel something new blooming beneath all that, something like closure. One afternoon, as I was reviewing files in the office, I came across the original hand-drawn map my grandfather had sketched in 1987. It was yellowed now, edges curling, but the pencil lines were still bold, steady. His handwriting neat and simple: read back fence. Turn left at the rock. Cows love this spot. I traced my finger along the border he drew, remembering the walks we used to take together. How he'd stop and show me where the earth dipped just enough to hold rain, or where the wind always turned cold at dusk. He knew this land the way an old sailor knows the sea. And somehow, even through all the noise, lies, and lawsuits, we'd brought it back to him. I framed that map and hung it in the community barn. That barn had become something beautiful. It wasn't just for tools and hay anymore. We'd turned it into a teaching space, a gathering hall, a living museum of land rights and legacy. Kids from nearby schools visited on field trips. Retired farmers gave talks about how to read a land deed or protect your property line. We even held a monthly potluck called Fence Post Friday, where neighbors shared food and stories. The kind that don't fit in court records but matter all the same. One evening, a boy named Miles came up to me after a storytelling night. He couldn't have been more than 9 years old, with a loose shoelace and a face full of questions. "Is it true they tried to steal your farm?" he asked, eyes wide. I nodded. "Yes," I said, "but we stopped them." He frowned thoughtfully. How I smiled. We remembered everything they hoped we forgot, and we never gave up. He nodded slowly, then ran off to chase fireflies. I watched him go, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight lift. We had done what we came to do. We had guarded the legacy. Now it was time to pass the light on. Later that season, I made a decision. I announced that I would step down as the full-time director of Landline Defense. I wasn't disappearing, just making room for others to lead. Younger voices, fresh eyes. I would remain as an advisor and mentor, but it was time for me to come back home in a deeper way. Not just physically, but spiritually. The land needed me again, not as a soldier, but as a steward. I planted new fruit trees near the southern fence, the same place my grandfather once tried growing peaches. I repaired the old tractor with the help of some local kids who wanted to learn. I rebuilt the porch swing, and I took time to sit in it, to breathe, to listen, to remember. One quiet morning I walked to the farthest corner of the property, where an old oak tree shaded my grandfather's grave. I sat beside it, not in sadness, but in reflection. Words on the stone hadn't faded. A man of the land, honest, steady, unshaken. I rested my hand on the earth and whispered, "It's safe now. You were right. They tried, but they failed." I stayed there a long time, listening to the wind rustle through the grass. I didn't need answers anymore. I didn't need revenge. I had the land, I had the truth, and I had the story hours. Looking back, I realized now that they never really wanted the land. Not truly. They wanted control. They wanted silence. But they forgot one thing. You can't erase history just by covering it in concrete. The soil remembers. The stones remember. And so do we. They thought they could build a resort and no one would notice. They thought a quiet old man would never speak up. They thought profit would bury legacy. They were wrong. We stood, we fought, we won. And now, we plant. That's how it ends, not with another courtroom battle or another headline, but with roots. Roots that reach deep into the ground and deep into the future. Roots that hold firm when storms come. Roots that whisper, "This land remembers." Because it does. Because we do. If you enjoyed this powerful true story, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to Bright Reality for more eye-opening stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines.